Moments ago, the House of Commons descended into chaos. The air turned electric, and Nigel Farage, the man many thought would never return to the centre of power, stood face to face with Keir Starmer in what's already being called one of the most explosive parliamentary showdowns in recent British history. What began as a routine Prime Minister's questions erupted into open warfare when Starmer, in a moment of fury, branded the Reform Party racist. The chamber froze. Gasps echoed across the benches. Then, with a tone sharper than ever heard before, Farage rose from his seat, his voice shaking with both anger and conviction, and delivered a response that shattered the Commons into uproar. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were everywhere. Ex-YouTube, TikTok. Millions watched as Starmer tried to keep his composure while Farage accused the Prime Minister of insulting millions of ordinary Britons. What followed wasn't just a political clash, it was a full-scale moral explosion. One that exposed the growing divide between the people and the powerful, between Britain's past and its uncertain future. It began like any other Wednesday rows of MPs filled the green benches, papers rustling, whispers trading between rival sides. Starmer entered first, confident, calm, the image of control. The Labour front bench smiled as cameras flicked on, as though the chaos of recent weeks hadn't shaken them. But beneath the polished surface, something was boiling. Farage had arrived earlier, flanked by Reform MPs now holding seats that once belonged to the old Conservative strongholds. It was the first time he'd attended Prime Minister's questions in person since the party's surge. In by-elections, the atmosphere was tense, part disbelief, part anticipation. Westminster could feel that something was coming. Then the question came, a simple challenge about immigration figures and the government's handling of border control. But what should have been a dry exchange quickly turned into fire. Farage accused the Prime Minister of losing control, of betraying Brexit's promise, of letting unelected elites shape Britain's future from behind closed doors. And then Starmer snapped. With a cold stare and a raised voice, he shot back, "We will not take lectures from racists in Reform UK." The silence that followed was deafening. For a second, the Commons seemed to hold its breath. Even his own MPs looked unsure, not because they disagreed, but because they sensed the gravity of what had just been said. Across the chamber, Farage's face hardened. Slowly, he stood, ignoring the speaker's attempts to quiet the room. And in that moment, the mask of politics fell away. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was a reckoning. Farage's voice thundered, "You dare call millions of working-class Britons racist? The same people your government abandoned, are overtaxed and silenced." Cheers erupted from the opposition benches. Shouts of "Hear, hear!" from corners of Parliament rarely united before Starmer tried to interject. But the noise drowned him out. The Prime Minister's smile faded. Within hours, the footage spread like wildfire. The phrase "racist party" was trending nationwide alongside "Farage erupts." Supporters of both sides flooded social media with fury. Labour loyalists defended Starmer's words as truth spoken to power. Reform voters called it proof of contempt, that the ruling elite no longer saw them as citizens but as enemies. Outside Parliament, protesters began to gather. Some waved the Union Jack, others carried signs reading, "We are not racist, we are British." The BBC tried to contain the narrative, calling it an unfortunate exchange. Sky News called it a defining moment. But the damage was done. Farage, sensing his moment, doubled down. He appeared outside the Commons, cameras flashing, declaring, "This is the moment. Britain must decide whether it stands with free speech or with state-sanctioned insults." His tone was pure theatre, but his message cut deep. He wasn't just attacking Starmer. He was challenging the system itself. By nightfall, even members of Labour's own ranks were uneasy. Anonymous briefings leaked to the press suggested senior advisers had warned Starmer not to engage personally with Farage, that he'd fallen into the one trap he couldn't afford, giving the populist oxygen. But it was too late. The words were out. The clip was viral. The headlines were written behind the scenes. Number 10 aides were scrambling. They feared that this wasn't just a gaffe. It was the spark of something much bigger. Reform's polling numbers had already begun to creep upward in working-class constituencies. Now, Starmer's insult had given Farage exactly what he wanted: moral ammunition. For years, he had claimed that the establishment looked down on ordinary people. Now, the Prime Minister had said it aloud. Was this an accident, or was Starmer deliberately trying to push Farage into a corner? To label, isolate and discredit him before the next election season ignited? The nation waited for an answer. But one thing was clear: a line had been crossed. And deep inside Westminster, whispers began to grow. Could this be the beginning of the end for Labour's fragile moral authority? Or would the machine strike back harder, silencing Farage once and for all before his movement grew unstoppable? By dawn the next morning, Westminster looked like a city under siege. Camera vans lined the streets. Journalists huddled outside Number 10, waiting for a statement that never came. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that feels like the breath before a storm. Inside Downing Street, aides argued in circles. Some wanted Starmer to apologise, to de-escalate before things spiralled out of control. Others insisted he double down, that admitting error now would look weak. The Prime Minister sat in silence, reading the headlines flashing across every network. Starmer calls reform racist. Farage fights back. Britain divided once again. It wasn't just a political scandal anymore. It was a moral one. What began as an insult had become a mirror reflecting the country's deepest fracture lines. In pubs across northern towns, people argued over breakfast. He's right, Starmer's lost touch with real people, one voice said. Nonsense, another replied. Farage plays the victim while stirring hate. Across the nation, the conversation had turned poisonous, but also alive, and for the first time in years, millions were listening again. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, aides delivered morning briefings to the King. The monarch was said to be deeply concerned about the tone of politics. One insider described him as visibly uneasy about what he called a war of words, turning into a war of hearts. The palace refused to comment publicly, but privately, conversations began about whether the Crown could remain silent as the country tore itself apart. By noon, Farage appeared again, this time outside the Reform Party headquarters. He looked triumphant, defiant. His voice echoed over the crowd of reporters. "You can call us whatever names you like," he declared, "but you will not silence the British people." Cheers followed. The cameras captured every word. His speech spread online faster than any official statement from the government could hope to. Inside Parliament, Labour MPs watched the coverage with a mixture of disbelief and dread. They knew what was happening. The Prime Minister's insult had turned into Farage's crusade. Within 24 hours, Reform had gained 3 points in the polls. A small rise, but one that shook the political establishment. That evening, Starmer faced his cabinet. The atmosphere was glacial. Chancellor Rachel Reeves was furious, yet she warned that the economy couldn't afford weeks of populist mayhem. Angela Rayner, uncharacteristically silent, sat with her arms folded. When she finally spoke, her words were ice cold. Keir, the people aren't listening to your policies anymore. They're listening to your tone. And right now they hear contempt. The Prime Minister didn't respond. Instead, he dismissed the meeting early, ordering aides to prepare an emergency address to the nation. The plan was to reset the narrative, to reframe his words as a defence of tolerance. But no speech could undo the soundbite already burned into public memory. That night, outside the gates of Parliament, something extraordinary happened. Thousands gathered at a spontaneous protest that felt less like a rally and more like a movement. Farmers, veterans, small business owners and even former Labour voters stood shoulder to shoulder. Some carried placards reading, "We're not racist, we're British." Police formed lines. The chants grew louder. Farage! Farage! Reform! Britain! Inside the Commons, MPs peered through the windows as history repeated itself. The people, once ignored, were back at the gates. Farage, always the showman, arrived in person. Surrounded by flashing lights and a wall of supporters, he raised his hand and shouted, "This is not about me. It's about every man and woman who's been called a racist for loving their country." The crowd roared. In that moment, the divide between Parliament and the people felt wider than ever. Meanwhile, Labour strategists panicked. Private memos revealed internal fears that reform could now sweep dozens of marginal seats in an early election. The Starmer government had, in one careless remark, revived the very populism it thought it had buried. Foreign media joined in. American networks ran segments titled Britain's New Culture War. European papers mocked the chaos, calling it Brexit's ghost reborn. And somewhere in Washington, Donald Trump posted a single line on Truth Social. Farage was right again. Britain needs strong men, not weak words. By morning, Number 10 was in full crisis mode. Starmer's approval rating had collapsed by double digits overnight. The party's communications team drafted statements, apologies and denials, none of which could survive more than a single news cycle. The damage was already spiritual. The Prime Minister was no longer seen as a leader in control, but as a man cornered by his own arrogance. Behind the scenes, whispers grew louder. Could this be the moment that breaks Labour's unity? Was Angela Rayner preparing a move of her own? Or would she let Starmer self-destruct? And what of the King? Would he intervene with a speech of reconciliation? Or would royal silence be mistaken for consent? As night fell again over Westminster, Britain stood on edge. A Prime Minister accused of dividing the nation. A populist outsider suddenly speaking like a national conscience, and a royal family watching from the shadows as their country drifted towards something darker. The question everyone was asking was simple, but terrifying. If one word could unleash this much chaos, what happens when the people finally stop listening altogether?